Hey there, it's Andrea, and welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast. Today, I have with me Karalee Picard, and she has spent almost 10 years in the Navy as an intelligence officer supporting transportation, counterterrorism, and maritime missions with a focus on Eurasia and Russia. After 9/11, she deployed on USS Wasp to the Middle East, where her work supported the global war on terrorism. She worked at U.S. European Command for 3 years in uniform and 10 years as a member of the Federal Civil Service, employed by the Defense Intelligence Agency. And she is currently employed by the DIA at U.S. Strategic Command in Omaha, Nebraska, where she has a focus on global national security and supporting defense leadership with expertise in strategy, policy, leadership, and engagement. And she just completed a doctoral dissertation and was awarded her PhD from Creighton University. And I'm excited to talk about all these things. It's really great to have you here and to get your perspective on leadership, Karalee.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here, Andrea. It's an honor. Thank you for having me.
And one of the ways we got connected in the first place was through a mutual colleague who invited you to participate in a panel that I led for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And that was such a fun experience. It was fun to be able to get you and a few other people in the room to be able to talk about leadership and leadership philosophy. So it's really nice to be able to kind of dive a little deeper with you individually.
Thank you. Yeah, I look forward to this. That event was really fun too, and meeting the people in the class or the program, and then in the panel, and then meeting you and your team. That was a great day. Yeah,
it was a really good day. So would you kind of give us an idea of the trajectory of your career? I mean, we just heard it in the bio, but what do you think, or maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your specific role now and how the roles that you had leading up to this really prepared you for it?
Sure. Now my role is the chief of the Directors Action Group in the Intelligence Directorate at the Strategic Command. And really the only way to prepare for that is to be in the Department of Defense or in a similar role for many years, because now I'm looking at national strategy, defense strategies, giving advice on where we can add more value, be more clear in the language that we use. And then I help draft the communications for our director up the chain of command. So not only to the 4-star commander, but then up to Department of Defense and to the Director of National Intelligence. So, and then we also draft a lot of language. I have one teammate, so she and I draft language for the workforce also, prepping for all hands. And we're doing a diversity inclusion event Friday. So we're drafting all that language and training people to facilitate sessions. So you're working on culture.
Yeah. And culture and communications, you must be very intentional about the words that you choose.
Absolutely, we must, right. And that comes from years of experience, like even understanding what other countries are doing with their militaries or with their foreign policy, being very intentional on which language we use, because words mean many different things to people. And then also understanding what words your leadership wants you to use or don't want you to use. Like the boss does not want this word in his document. Like,
okay. So. Yeah. Do you ever?
Oh, can I just add the difference between intelligence writing or writing in for the government, for my leadership anyway, is that you need to be concise, because the leaders only have so many minutes in the day to read. They're engaging, they've got called, they're constantly making decisions. They only have a few minutes. So the typical report that we try to get up is like 10 or 12 lines. That's it. What does he need to know? Because he has very few minutes in the day. And there's typically a lot of background that goes into a lot of, other education that goes into it. But when something happens, 10 or 12 lines, get the point across. And then when I went into my dissertation, all of that coursework was like, oh no, you need 10 pages. And I'm like, but I said everything in 5. I said all of my words in 5 pages. So I had to get more verbose, I guess.
I mean, how do you carry I'm projecting a feeling of weight, the weightiness of your position and what you do. So maybe you don't feel that as much as I would think that you would. Do you feel weighty? Does it feel weighty? How do you handle that?
Um, I think it develops over time, because as a junior analyst, you don't have as much weight. I had a boss who was great at teaching, what the leaders needed. I didn't know at the beginning, but as you grow and get into the next leadership position and think, okay, you get a report from a junior person. And honestly, almost every time I read something, I think, okay, this is good. And then I look away, I do something else, or I walk away for a few minutes, I come back and I was like, okay, what's missing? I know something's missing, or we can make it better. And so I see it as a team effort. I don't typically draft anything right now at work from scratch. I mean, there are emails, and this diversity thing we're doing, that was from scratch, but the communications, I get all sorts of written communications from the different divisions, those leaders, and then I take those and I tailor them for my leader to send up the chain of command. So it is definitely a team effort, and I will tweak their language. I won't change what they did or how they approached an issue, but I will tweak it so it's a different voice. It's the voice of my director, and take out some detail. Senior leaders don't need as much detail. So honestly, I don't feel like there's a lot of weight, because I've had all these years of training.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're prepared for it. Yeah.
Right.
And it sounds like when it's a team effort, it probably helps as well.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Right. I mean, I had an example last week where I had one sentence on some strategy one of the teams was developing, and I didn't have any more details. So the next person in the chain was like, oh, we need to add more here. And so I just removed it, because I know they don't have more detail right now. So I just removed it, and we will tackle that next week.
Very interesting. Oh my goodness. So fascinating. You've mentioned a couple times this diversity and inclusion event, it sounds like. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. It's a stand down. We're doing kind of an all hands, but it'll be each division, larger team will have smaller teams, and we've assigned facilitators, had mostly volunteers. And so we are doing the training. That's actually happening today while I'm out of the office, but we've developed some graphics to use as examples. You've probably seen the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's a good one to use for initial training. I used those last year, but we've had so much turnover that we're just doing another baseline. And then what we aim to do is facilitate actual conversations. We did this a few months ago with equal opportunity kind of sexual harassment training, and actually had quotes from surveys where we just prompted conversation. Like, if you heard this in the workforce as an employee, what would you do? Or if you heard this as a supervisor, how would you act? So we're doing that with diversity and inclusion as a way to kickstart participation in the council that we've formed, and to grow the awareness. And then next month or two, I'm not sure will happen in July, but the next event will be more all about belonging, that as a topic, because this week's is just not going to be long enough to tackle everything. So we're kind of scheduling out a few different topics to get people talking about it.
Yeah. How does that diversity inclusion fit into your overall job?
Well, I'm the senior sponsor for the council and wrote the charter, got that all signed. And so it's a really big issue of my passion. It's kind of front and center. I want to have not only, demographic diversity, but I want to see cognitive and experiential diversity in my teams, because we all think differently. And I really saw this in one of my jobs recently, where I've been an intelligence analyst for a long time. I do a lot of critical thinking. I see problems I can look at a problem from many different angles, because as an analyst, I'm supposed to put aside my own biases and think from another country's perspective, Like, how do they see us, or how do they see what they're doing? So anyway, when I joined this team of more HR and resource and IT specialists, I explained to them, look, I do see problems from different angles, so I'm interested in how you see these issues. And so it was very interesting. I learned a ton from them, and then I was able to add some value because I was always seeing problems from different angles. And that different experiential and cognitive diversity was really critical because we were able to elevate a number of issues. We even got more money to get some more personnel on board. So that was a big effort. And I think it was largely due to that cognitive diversity, everyone coming from a different angle.
Do you see that as being critical to the way we look at the world's issues and things like that too? And
Absolutely.
how do you see it? Yeah, I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Oh, well, it's basically like that example. If you all see a news report on, like Afghanistan just had a major earthquake, or there's wildfires in Nebraska, right? There's this whole thing going on with the Supreme Court, with abortion and gun rights and all the number of issues in the news right now. So a lot of people will just look at the Afghanistan issues like, okay, that's a world away. That doesn't affect me, you know. But if you think about it in terms of, wow, that's going to set them back even farther, it doesn't affect me on a daily basis. But knowing the world is out there and being mindful and trying to bring in different perspectives, to me, is really important. It's something I talk to my daughter about really often. And she, as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine in February, she stayed up after midnight just keeping track of what was going on. She was so appalled. And that kind of died down, of course, because it's unfortunately becoming normal.
Mm-hmm.
But I was in Ukraine for several months in college, and I really empathize. I was in those neighborhoods, in the Independence Square, and I feel terrible for them. But I think, so to get back really to your question, this different ways of seeing the world can make people more empathetic, but also it would really help us probably solve some big problems if we all came together with our different viewpoints and listened to each other and learned from each other and started trying to find common ground. That would be amazing.
What do you think gets in the way of that?
Our personal biases, our circle of people we surround ourselves with who influence our thoughts and our perspectives. I've always been an independent thinker, so yes, of course, I'm somewhat influenced by my friends and family, but I don't always agree with them. But we can have conversations about it. Okay, what do you think about this issue? That doesn't mean we're going to agree, but we don't fall out over it. And I know during the pandemic, some family and friends were just falling out over issues, and that's really, it's heartbreaking.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. There are a lot of divisions where people seem to put stakes in the ground and tie their identity so tightly to beliefs and opinions that feels like there's no way to actually have that conversation that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Since we were just talking about diversity and inclusion, one of the questions that I have for you is, how have you seen that emphasis on diversity of, like you said, demographics, perspective, age, and all the different things? How have you seen that shift over the years? The emphasis on it, I should say, and the
Well,
need for it.
Yeah.
Maybe the need's always been there, but
The need has, you're right, the need has been there, but we weren't acknowledging it a couple decades ago, whenever I started my career, but it wasn't a thing. And I think, baby boomers often had the same job for a long time, or the same type of job. And it seems like the Gen Y and Z are moving a lot more often. And that's not, that's not a perfect model, but every generation thinks differently too, because we change our education systems and we change, social media and just the internet changed a great deal of the available information. My gosh, we still have a set of encyclopedias from when I was younger. We don't really use it, but that was our source. I remember going through card catalog at college, trying to find a book, trying to find topics, that's not what we do now these days. But I think all factors into that cognitive piece. We're thinking differently, the younger generation, the tech natives or information natives, they're born with all of this, an iPhone in their hand or, an iPad in their crib.
Mm-hmm.
They're just, and it's not, none of it is bad. It's just, I think the diversity piece has come more to light because of this information age has brought it more to light. People are able to get their own voices out and say, hey, wait a minute. And honestly, in organizations, oftentimes it's the demographic diversity that is most evident because that's what you see. It's the cognitive and experiential that you don't know. So I'm hoping this series of events that we're doing at work starts bringing that out, because I know people have diverse backgrounds. We all think differently, but we don't always share our background, our experiences. Like if you're born in a small town, this is something I talk to my team about. Look, we don't want everybody at a meeting to decide a new policy necessarily. We're talking about a rotation policy for some of our positions. What I would want to see is somebody who wants to stay in place, somebody who doesn't want to stay in place, somebody who is from Nebraska and somebody who's not from Nebraska, and somebody who you think will always say no, somebody who will support it. And you might get some overlap with all of those, and then get some actual demographic diversity on top of that. And I mapped that example out for some colleagues, just to say, look, this is how we could do this, because we could get all of those demographic pieces as we're answering those other questions. But you have to be intentional about it. And then you bring those people together and you start talking about this new policy and see where it goes.
Because the goal, from what it sounds like you're saying, the goal is to get to the best answer, not for you to come up with the best answer and then have everybody approve it.
Right.
Yeah.
As a leader, I'm not the smartest person in the room necessarily.
Yeah.
And
there's so much intelligence in the room. Yes. Why wouldn't we? Right. Yeah.
And I'm going to miss something anyway. I might say, yes, let's have this policy. And then I have to move. Well, I actually don't want to move. So I support the policy, but I don't want to be part of it. But I don't want to be biased either. So that's another reason to bring this group of people together. And let's see what everybody thinks, or at least a segment thinks. So back to your question about diversity and how it's changed, it's just a lot more important now. We need that. I think for organizations to grow, we have to look at those three pieces of diversity. And part of it is bringing in the demographic diversity, because that is what we could measure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then the rest will come with that.
Yeah.
Very important.
Okay. I would love to talk about your dissertation, because obviously you spent, I'm sure, years working on this. What was it that you were looking for? What were you searching for in your research?
Having been a DIA civilian for many years and having gone through many reorganizations in the intelligence centers, I was looking for what leaders in those centers could do to bring the DIA civilians along with them in the reorganization, like get agreement from them, get buy-in. There are long-term civilians who don't like change, and they will wait out a leader. Or the leaders in those centers are there for about 2 years. And the long-term civilians who don't like change will say, okay, we'll change for now. And then when the new leader comes in, they will work really hard to change that leader's mind and go back to where they were. I've seen it many times. Now, there's always incremental changes that stick. Some things will stick. But what I was looking for was, what should leaders in those centers be doing? to bring the civilians along with them, because the civilians in these centers are the core employees. Military rotate in and out. A couple of the overseas locations actually have civilians who rotate in and out, but they'll be there for 3 to 5, maybe 7 years at most. Whereas still the military rotating every 2-3 years. In the United States, civilians can be in one place for 25-30 years if they want to. There's no requirement to move. So you kind of need buy-in. They're the ones that influence the organizational culture too, the civilians.
You don't want just compliance. You want actual buy-in. This actually makes sense. I actually want to do this. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what I was looking for, really ultimately a list of best practices for these leaders. Here's what you should be doing if you want to bring your civilians along with you and help actually change the culture for good in the long term, get the culture to stick. And part of it was a lot of research into defining different terms I would use, like what is culture? What is, once I started looking at describing where these centers fit in the Department of Defense and who influences, how do we get our money, who directs us to do analysis or whatnot. They're complex. The organizations themselves are complex. They have many matrix tasks. So managers in different places who all want to know what's going on. So it pulls on people's time and like, who do I report to? I had one participant, I interviewed 14 people, DIU civilians, and one of those said, I don't really have a boss. I have a lot of people who tell me what to do and who want to know what I'm doing, but I don't feel like I have a boss. So there's a lot going on in these organizations, and complex matrix, bureaucratic. And in the analysis side of these organizations, there's many different other careers, but in the analysis career field, those employees basically have 2 chains of command. They have the traditional hierarchical military chain of command, but then the analysis has to go through different people. And sometimes it changes, like, okay, I'm an expert in Russia strategy, and this person's an expert in Russia military operations. And as senior people, we both want to see your report. And then what I found is one participant said that those 2 people were not agreeing. And so she was left to figure out who was going to, like, what language she was going to end up with in her article. That's not really fair to a junior person. So anyway, I was digging into some of these things. That was just a little side anecdote. But ultimately, I have created a list of best practices to figure out what leaders should be doing. And so I ended up coming up with a couple themes. One about culture, that when a new leader comes into an organization, they really need to spend time learning about culture, the culture of their organization. And I think how that happens is that the leaders under them and civilians, so sometimes the leaders with official leadership titles are only military, and the civilians in some cases are in the analyst side. The analysts are typically not leaders, they're senior analysts, and they have informal leadership roles. So what my thought is that all of those leaders, formal and informal, should start when they in-brief the new incoming commander. They should integrate different aspects of culture. They don't even have to say, hey, I'm going to talk to you about culture today. But at some point, they should say, look, these few things are really important to our culture and our division, because that's one way for the leader to start learning. Because in my mind, from all of these interviews, I'm not sure the center's leaders fully knew what the culture was.
I was just going to ask that.
Yeah.
How hard is that for them to even identify in the first place?
It's very hard because we don't talk about culture that way.
Yeah.
One example is that, so I don't know if you know the government pay structure, but the senior intelligence analysts really are the GG15s, and the 14s have a similar title. And then the 13s, they'll have like a team lead senior analyst position. And then this 14 would be like a branch senior analyst. So there's different levels. And what I found is that the 15s are not the doers anymore. They They know the problem set, they know how to write, they know how to communicate up and down the chain. But it's the 13s and 14s who are the doers of the organization. And they're the ones who were often most affected by reorganization, because the leaders would say, oh yeah, let's improve these things. But what they didn't realize was that at the 13 and 14 level, processes were broken. Like how they did their work, which is culture. How do we get work done? And that caused a lot of strife in that level. So understanding who owns processes or who uses processes, I think, is important. That's the culture piece that I think the leaders should learn. Yeah. And then the other piece is about using a planning model for a reorganization, because in the Department of Defense, we plan every day. We're constantly planning for the next military operation or assessing the last one. And so we have paid planners on staff that could come in, use a similar, I created my own planning structure for an organization, organizational change, but it would be essentially based on that model, because the planners are very rigorous. Like, we do a mission analysis, we develop some courses of action, and there's a planning team in there. You form a planning team. And then one of the best practices is to formally or informally identify your champions of these changes. And part of that is the planning team. Who can I bring in who, again, getting that diversity piece, supports the change, opposes the change, is ambivalent to the change, and then bring in some other diversity too. But as you start building up that team, you'll have champions, and then they should go into their work centers and create more champions. And you don't have to even call those people that, there's no performance objective for champion.
Right.
It doesn't quite work that way. People have to buy into it because they have trust in you. I only had 2 themes and 13 sub-themes, but trust is in there. Trust builds buy-in, right? They want to be able to communicate. They want to ask their questions. And by having the champions, unbeknownst to the leader even, who are the champions? They don't have to know who they are, but who are the people standing at the coffee pot or at the vending machine and overhearing others complain about this change, and who will speak up and explain a little bit more, or answer questions, or take their question up the chain of command to get an answer. So that's your champions. And it's hard to put something really tangible in place for that, but I think it's worth doing.
So if somebody wanted to put something tangible in place for champions, do you have any thoughts on what that would look like?
It would involve lots of conversations. That's where the supervisors and managers and even informal leaders should be brought into conversations, especially reorganization conversations. In one of the centers that I studied, only the 15s and military officers were brought in for those conversations. And then there were rumors going around.
Yes.
Like, right? Rumor mill. And we were in the middle of a pandemic.
Oh,
and
yeah.
People were anxious about many things. And one of those commands had somewhat of a crisis going on anyway. So they had people on shift work. They had people that were not coming into the office at all anymore. And there was this air. The air was disturbed by this reorganization rumor. So bringing those different levels of people into conversations, building your relationship with your supervisor is really vital. If you don't have a relationship with your supervisor, who are you going to for answers?
And if you don't know who your supervisor is, that sounds like that would be a problem as well.
Yes, especially in reorganizations, right? There were people who months later didn't realize they had a new supervisor because they were out of the office. Yeah. And the communication was so low, or their previous supervisor hadn't really communicated. And so when that just dried up, they didn't really get concerned. They were like, okay, it's normal. So
just keep doing my thing.
Right. Yeah. But those relationships with supervisors, that's really where you'd find your champions. And having a tangible, I think it would be great if we could do a performance objective about, how are you championing your work center's successes, or your colleagues. How are you championing your colleagues? You shouldn't always just show up and talk about yourself with your supervisor. You just say, hey, you know what this guy did over here, or this lady's doing a great job. That's amazing. It's not everybody that will do that. But if you put it in a performance objective, ask them, what are your colleagues doing to help you or other people? Maybe that's the way to do it. And I'm just making this up right now. I haven't thought about it.
Yeah, no, it's just an interesting conversation because
Yeah.
I find getting buy-in to be just fascinating, because I've seen plenty of times when a leader makes a declaration and expects everybody to follow, but they end up being upset that people don't really buy in, that they're just complying, that they don't give that extra effort. But then how do you, so one of my questions that I'm constantly searching for and getting people's perspective on is this one, and I'm going to ask you about it. What do you think is the difference between healthy and unhealthy influence in getting buy-in?
Well, unhealthy influence is when that leader just is directive. Okay, you will do this. And then not taking questions. The healthy aspect, I'll give you a short answer, just that the healthy aspect would be, taking members' questions and trying to answer them, or, trying to help them rationalize what's going on and why they should do this. Because I think we all want to know why we're in an organization. What is my value? Why do I stay here? And having those conversations is important. One thing I want to mention here is that one of the sub-themes was about the unique skills that intelligence analysts have. And I think every organization has a certain section of their organization where there's some unique skills, whether it's engineers or IT specialists. I'm not sure, I don't know every organization, but in the intelligence centers, in the analysis pieces, analysts have really unique skills. They're unique in the fact that they're so intangible that leaders don't recognize them necessarily. We hire and pay people and train people to have critical thinking skills, which is, again, intangible. And many of these analysts are oftentimes looking at foreign leaders' words, like what is Putin saying? What is Xi Jinping saying? What are their military generals saying? What are they doing? So that they say what they're going to do or not. What do they not say that we think they're going to do? Everything
Looking
is
for patterns, I assume.
Yes.
Looking for,
yes.
Yeah.
And even as you go up the chain, as you promote to the next levels of, me doing strategy now, I'm also looking for what are our leaders saying? Not to criticize them, absolutely, but they might say something about diversity. Hey, diversity is really important. Those few words in a press statement, now I know it's important. I'm going to go do that because the Secretary of Defense or whomever has said it's important. And that's all it takes for a U.S. leader in intelligence anyway. Like, this is what they're saying, or hey, he or she emphasized we need more, I'll just say cowbell. We need more cowbell in this area. Now I know what I need to focus on. So I think the analysts, my point here is really that the analysts are doing this on a daily basis with foreigners, foreign operations, and they do that with us. They do that with our senior leaders. So they are analyzing the words of their own leaders. And so when the leader gets up and just says, just reorg, just do it, and the analysts ask a question, a logical question, okay, I understand this. Now you've created another division that does the same thing I'm doing. How are we going to split this work? And the leader says, just do it. The analyst is going to lose confidence. They're not going to trust them. And then the leader gets frustrated. Why don't you trust me? Because you haven't communicated.
Yeah. And
one analyst said, look, we're going to find some answer because in our regular job, we can see A and B, or, in this case, you've said A and B. but C and D are missing. So if I don't get an answer to C and D, I will make assumptions, I will make my best guess, or I will keep digging until I find answers, because that's what we were paid to do.
Mm-hmm.
So this is part of the culture that the leader should look at, and in any organization.
Okay, so when a leader, like top level leader, has people who are thinking strategically and they are asking these kinds of questions, have you seen that top level leader get or feel threatened by that?
There's probably some of that. Maybe
Okay.
they don't have answers
Yeah.
to all of the questions, and they just don't. I understand too, just by working in this arena for so long, is that they're really busy. They're overtasked. Their
Sure.
schedules are always full.
Yeah.
It's hard to get time with them. I think if they don't have answers and they just don't want to bother answering it, then they might feel that way. And I don't have any evidence on that, but maybe.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think I've seen that. Certainly not in the same context, but
Yeah.
yeah. Interesting. And okay, so still on the topic of getting buy-in.
Yeah.
Another, and I'm wondering if you saw this at all, if this, I don't know what all your subtopics were. Did you see anything with the need for people, or people feeling the need or responding better when they felt like they had agency, when they felt like they could make a difference in some capacity, so they had a voice in the matter? What did you see with that?
That absolutely came out. Yes, that was evident. There were a few participants that felt like they did have a voice, that their leadership was willing to listen to them. That didn't always get them what they wanted, but they felt listened to. They felt they had trust in their leader. And something to remember with civil servants is that civil servants have pretty high public service motivation. They want to be in the job. They want to serve, but they want to understand how they're providing that value too. So one thing that one leader that a couple people talked about was that leader made themselves available. They had an all hands where they outlined the whole reorganization and they took questions on the spot. And if they didn't know the answer, they would say, okay, come back and see me, but I'm going to get you an answer. They were very open and transparent. And everyone I talked to that had that experience really valued that. And then underneath that person, they were, the next level also made themselves available. We could go ask questions. And those leaders, especially the top one in that case, allowed employees to have emotion about the whole thing, like be angry. That's fine, but bring your questions, and don't just bring a problem, bring me a solution. If you see the problem and you know a solution, please tell me, because again, I don't know everything. I don't know all of the processes that are getting disrupted. So that was valuable. Having agency is really important. Another few participants really didn't feel like they had agency. But they would say things that made me very aware that they were committed to this mission. They wanted to be in this mission. They just felt like they were pushed aside, that their questions, that they didn't matter to the leader because they weren't getting answers. Actually, the first sub-theme was that mid-level members are vital to the mission. So I talked about the 14s and 13s as, being critical, but also those mid-level military members, the managers. The military are usually the managers, and the civilians are usually non-supervisory. So those mid-level military members were usually the ones that did answer questions, or at least let them be asked, let all of these questions come in, give information as they had it. That's kind of how some of the rumors not probably started, but also those mid-level managers were giving, hey, here's a new org chart that people are talking about. And so it prompted more questions. Okay, I see I'm over here now, and my colleague who does half of my process is in a different part of the organization. But those mid-level leaders were really vital to answering a lot of the questions, and at least bringing questions up the chain. What was frustrating was that they weren't necessarily getting answers back. But those mid-level leaders were valued as champions of the workforce because they were listening. Yeah, somebody should be listening.
They have such an interesting role, being both the champions of the workforce and the change, having to kind of manage both of those things at the same time.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you want to tell us about your findings before I ask a different question?
The other piece is, I had 3 proposed solutions. One was about culture, learning all the culture. One was about the planning, developing a plan and a team. And then the other piece was communication. Leaders should really communicate early. Hey, I'm thinking about this. And oftentimes those leaders of the centers have higher people in authority who are telling them to change.
Okay.
So, just communicating that, look, the boss wants something else. And so we're going to talk about this early and often, and then getting those mid-level members into that planning team or into the conversations early, because then you can head off a lot of these emotions and a lot of the questions, and even people holding out until you leave to change everything back. In one organization, that did happen, that they just waited it out and changed back. So really the communications piece is a really big, it was a big topic. It didn't have like a standalone theme, definitely sub-theme, but again, these intelligence analysts are always communicating in writing, in briefings, they're thinking critically. So communicating to them early and often would help alleviate some of that anxiety, get them buy-in to the whole process. And so also having that communication strategy in the plan, at least having, the planning team helps plan out where you should be communicating.
So through the process of obviously your whole career, and then also your dissertation research, your PhD courses, what do you feel is your leadership philosophy, or the things that you really cling to in terms of what makes a good leader?
I think number one, valuing your people, listening, absolutely listening, because then you're going to know their capabilities, their own passions, and then empowering them for success, giving them some room to take charge of their tasks, their functions, letting them fail once in a while, that's okay, but be there, be available to help empower them the right way before that happens. Being open. I'm not a fan of open door policies, but always making myself available. Like, come and see me. But I purposely don't have an open door policy, because that can be, at least in my experience, that can actually disrupt the chain of command. And that's what I like to avoid. But another piece of my philosophy is kind of mentoring and coaching and giving people, not always mentoring and giving guidance, but asking the right questions so that they can find their path for success. How can I help people grow? Because someday I'm not going to be in that position. Somebody's going to have to take over. So I'm always planning for, if I'm not there, who's going to take over? So empowering people, listening, mentoring, coaching. I'm really big on accountability, holding myself accountable. Like, if I say I'm going to do something, it will be on my to-do list until I did it. Persevering, I think, for any organization, any leader, persevere through the challenges, keep going. We're all going to have challenges. That's the job, is to overcome challenges in I think every job I've ever had. Otherwise, what are we doing?
Why bother with a job?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, there's a difference between leaders and managers, and it's not uncommon to hear that leaders make sure we do the right thing and managers make sure we do it right, like follow the process or the policy.
Love that.
that leaders are looking up. Yeah. So I'd say that's where I come from as a leader.
What is one of the most meaningful leadership lessons that you have learned?
Well, really, it's listening and knowing I'm not the smartest person in the room. In my bio, it says I had maritime experience analyzing maritime issues, and I was taking over the ground team, so Army issues. I did not have Army expertise. I was out of my element, but I had a good group of analysts who had been in the Army and were looking at Army issues. They would almost daily tell me what was going on. This unit is deployed out in the field, or this unit is doing a bridging exercise or whatever. I don't know what that looks like. So I would just ask them, okay, what exactly are those soldiers doing when they deploy? Because I know what it looks like for a ship to deploy, bridging exercise. Okay, what does the equipment look like? So we had great conversations about this. But then in doing that, I think because I had spent time with them, when I then wanted them to change how they tracked all that information, it was kind of an uphill battle at first. But as I got to know them and they started trusting me, I gave them an example of, it was a long time ago. So it was just an Excel spreadsheet, but I was like, hey, can you just track all of this? Use a color coding system. And because we'd spent all that time together, they were finally like, okay, yeah, we'll try this out. And then it stayed. It's been going on more than a decade. That office was prepared when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. Nobody else was tracking it in that great detail. So that was a huge success to me. But what I learned from that was that I listened and I built their trust. And then I told them, here's a spreadsheet, fix it however you want to, but this is kind of what I have in my mind. And that's what they did. They altered it. They bought into it.
Yeah. Well, and it's amazing how people are like, even if you're an outsider, if you really listen and they feel heard, how much trust you're able to build with that.
Right.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And
Great
then
story.
years later, a member of that team, I came across them. I was working with a member of that team again. And because we had that relationship and I was more at a senior level, I wasn't into the details of every single message, every single thing that came up. But that member was able to change my mind several times because he was in the details. He could read out, he had memorized the serial numbers of reports and the dates and times that things came out. He's like, oh, on this report and this happened. I was like, okay, all right, we're going to change the assessment then, because he was in the details.
Yeah.
But I had that trust in him also,
Yeah.
because of how we worked together in the past.
That's cool. So people are often faced with roadblocks to getting their ideas or their initiatives, like considered at work. So we're talking mid-level and probably down from there. From your perspective, how should aspiring and emerging leaders approach their supervisors with their ideas for change?
It's an excellent question. I was contemplating that after you sent it over. That was probably the one that I was like, But I think it goes to that relationship with your supervisor. You should really build that relationship. And again, it's not always easy. Every supervisor is different. Some are introverted and they have their own issues going on in their lives. And so I think employees shouldn't feel, I think employees will feel that their supervisor doesn't like them. But honestly, what I try to remember is they have their own stuff going on. So maybe it's not the right time. I'll try again. So definitely try to develop that relationship with the supervisor, because through that, you're going to learn their style of communications. You're going to learn how much detail they want to know to make a decision. As a member, you're going to learn, do they want more quantitative data to make this decision? And so then you'll be able to better prepare yourself when you go in there to ask how to overcome a roadblock. If you have an initiative, or if you're, maybe you want to work fewer hours in a week because you have something else going on. And if you can show your supervisor, I can still do the tasks I'm assigned, but I need a few more hours off on a routine basis. Maybe you want a regular day off. That happens in DoD, not so much in intelligence because we have to be there all the time, but it does happen. I think the other thing is the employee resource groups. If you have ERGs, definitely join that. If you're not having success just getting to know your supervisor, join an ERG and start learning more from your peers, getting to know your peers, because they'll be able to give you ideas also on the culture of that organization. Maybe your supervisor's been there a long time and they have 2 or 3 years until they retire. They're not interested in helping you overcome anything. There's that image sometimes, right? Maybe it's not even true, but people will say that, and you can still try and say, look, I really want to start this initiative for the long-term health of the organization, recognizing that that supervisor might be leaving soon. Maybe somebody in that group will have been supervised by that person too, and they know how to best approach the supervisor. So part of it is being a good follower, learning your leader. And then part of learning would be how you can lead in that position later. This is what I talk to my team is like, okay, as my office manager, you're going to sit in my seat someday. I know you're going to be promoted enough to be in my seat. So, learning how I do things will affect how you do things in the future. But there's this whole cycle going on as a follower, member of the organization, learning the leader to get over roadblocks. That's part of the emerging leader training too, because you're learning that culture and how you're going to lead.
It's just been so good to have this conversation with you. I'm so glad for you and grateful for the work that you do and the intentionality that you put into it, the thoughtfulness, the humanity that you bring to it. And I just am just so glad that we were able to have this conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I had a great time chatting with you and getting through all these details that are just rattling around in my head mostly.
May I ask one more question? It is
Sure.
the question that I close every interview with, which is, what advice do you have for somebody who would like to have a voice of influence?
Wow. I think from my background and experiences, just start asking questions, because through questions, you'll start dialogues. And even as informal leaders with no title, you're going to have influence. One of my favorite examples is even as like a child, you're leading because you have influence, especially I'm a middle child. So as a middle child, I was leading my brother to give me what I want. Hey, I want to watch my cartoons. That's leading, right? You have influence. Leading my little sister to, not play with my toys or whatever that was. Leading my parents to get what I wanted for dinner, maybe. But it all starts very early. And even throughout my dissertation studies, informal leaders, not recognized as leaders, but they definitely lead. They are influencing people all the time. So if you want to have a voice of influence, just keep being you and influence the people around you, your peers, colleagues, your family. That's leadership.
Thank you so much, Karalee.
Yeah.
Appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here.